Hey guys and welcome to the channel. Today I will be doing a what if, which is what if Deku was an adventurer part 1. I did not make this what if fanfiction. The author of this amazing fanfiction is Logger3, so please support their work, and if you like the video be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Now then, cue the intro. The UA dungeon is the oldest and most well-known dungeon in the Mightian Empire, situated within the town of Mustafu. Izuku Midoriya, an aspiring adventurer, arrives at Mustafu with a group of his peers that wish to have nothing to do with him, leaving him to face the challenges of the dungeon and his life outside of it by himself. "Hurry up, Deku!" Izuku grumbled as Bakugo yelled out at him, hoisting his pack higher onto his back. They had been traveling for almost a week now, and they were getting close to the town of Mustafu, home of the UA dungeon. Izuku didn't know why it was called that, but apparently, dungeons had name tags over their entrances that helped differentiate them. He finished adjusting his pack and looked up at the rest of the group in front of him. There it was! Mustafu! Even though it was almost nighttime, he could tell they were still about an hour's walk from the town, but still, they were so close. Izuku couldn't wait to go on his first dungeon crawl. He'd been dreaming of this before he even got his class. He almost tripped over in his excitement, but steadied himself, the extra weight of his bag helping him from falling onto his face. He looked around to make sure no one had seen his blunder and was glad to see that everyone was ignoring him, like usual. "Alright everyone, listen up." Izuku raised his head again as the caravan leader, a lanky traveler in leather armor named Koichi, yelled out to all of them. "At the pace we're going, we'll reach Mustafu within the hour. Now I know you're all excited to rush right into the dungeon straight away, but I highly suggest taking the night to rest. We've been traveling for a while now, and even the first few levels of the dungeon can be dangerous when you're tired." Izuku nodded, even though he knew that Koichi couldn't see him. The man continued to yell as they walked. "I know very few of you are actually going to take me up on this, but if you actually do wait until tomorrow morning, I'll pay for your room at the inn, tonight only." A smile crept onto Izuku's face at that. He had managed to scrounge up a couple of silvers before they started traveling, but having his first night at the inn be paid for him was a really good thing. It meant that he got to get at least one dungeon run in before he had to draw out of his savings. Koichi fell silent again, and Izuku ignored the chattering between the other adventurers, knowing that none of it was directed at him. Instead, he held out his palm and allowed his stats to show, giving them a check to see if anything had grown over the course of their travel. Izuku Deku Midoriya level 6 class, fighter HP, 65-65 mana, 30-30 stamina, 80-80 strength, 11 agility, 15 endurance, 12 intelligence, 18 luck, 7 available abilities, double strike, your attack does double damage, before any reductions. 2 stamina per attack. Lunge, instantly dash forward a distance equivalent to your agility, and perform an attack. For stamina per attack, defender's shield, when standing within 5 meters of an allied creature, you can reduce the damage they take from an attack by an amount equal to your endurance. 2 stamina per use identify, allows you to see the stats and abilities of anything below a danger rating of 3. 1 mana per use traits, prodigy, you learn things more quickly and more easily than others. 50% boost to XP gain. Determined, nothing can stop you from achieving your goals. Resistant to the fear effect. Heroic, you are naturally inclined towards the protection of those who need it. Gives a 50% boost to all stats when a sentient creature with a non-combat class is within the line of sight of your opponent. Grants the ability to set and accept quests for added XP. He pouted. Nothing had gained any benefits. He guessed that even with his prodigy trait, it seemed that just tagging along on a trip wasn't any good for XP. Oh well, it didn't matter too much. As soon as he started making regular trips into the dungeon, he should start to grow really quickly. Now all he had to do was arrive in town and sleep for the night, and he could get up nice and early to go dungeon diving. He couldn't wait. The sun streamed in through his window and right onto his face. He groaned, rolling over and pulling the blanket the inn had provided him over his eyes. Was it morning already? Wait. It was morning already. Hell yeah. He flung the covers off of himself and quickly rushed over to the locked chest the inn provided to keep valuables in while sleeping and pulled the key out from his night pants. He pulled his gear out and quickly changed, pulling on the makeshift armor he had collected. It was mostly thick cloth, only slightly more protective than his everyday clothes, with a lot of fur padding around his chest and forearms. It made it fairly hot to wear, but Mustafu was a fairly chilly area so it balanced out. Alongside the padded shirt, there were some leather wraps around his chest. Leather and fur gauntlets protected his forearms, and a small cloak made from a dire wolf protected his upper back. It had taken him a lot of minor quests to earn enough money to buy that cloak, but dire wolf's skin and fur was more than strong enough to stop arrows from piercing his back. A basic helmet was strapped to his head as well, his face mostly uncovered by the leather. And finally, he got to the most expensive part of his equipment, his sword. The blacksmith at his old town wasn't a magic smith, so it was mundane, but Izuku had fought an owlbear to gather up enough funds to buy it, so he didn't really care. He strapped the scabbard to his belt and readjusted the thick cloth that wrapped around his waist, before heading out of the inn. Mustafu was a fairly prominent town in the Mightian Empire, mainly because of the UA dungeon. The dungeon had been around even before Emperor Yagi had struck down the demon king all for one, and most mages seemed to agree that it didn't have the usual degradation most other dungeons had after a few hundred years. It made the dungeon, and the town around it by coincidence, a very valuable place to be for starting adventurers. Izuku stumbled down the stairs of the inn and sighed contentedly as the smell of cooked food and the sounds of laughter flowed through the air. According to the timepiece on the wall, it was just after 6 in the morning, which meant breakfast was being served. Izuku tapped at the coin pouch he had on his waist and frowned. He only had around 12 silvers, and a proper breakfast would take 2 of them. Should he just use rations for today and have breakfast tomorrow, when he'd have some more coins from the dungeon? No, it was his first day, and he would need all the energy he could get. He ordered and paid for his food, eating it quickly. A few of the older adventurers around him glanced his way and smiled at him, and he nodded in return. Guess you're one of the newbies in town, right? Whole caravan of low levels here to try out the UA dungeon? Izuku turned to the innkeeper and nodded. Yep. I'll be heading in with some of the others later, I'm really excited. The innkeeper got a weird look on their face, before frowning. What do you mean later? The rest of the kids already headed over. Said that they had everyone they planned on bringing. Izuku froze as what the innkeeper said registered in his head, and he lowered his head, pushing a tear back as he bunked his forehead on the counter. Of course. Of course. Of course, Bakugo would do this. He knew how much Izuku was looking forward to going to the dungeon. Izuku was even willing to be in Bakugo's party. He just wanted to be an adventurer. He raised his head again after he felt like his tears weren't entirely obvious, and forced a smile onto his face. The innkeeper didn't seem to be buying it, a worried look on their face, but Izuku ignored it for now. He was going to go into the dungeon, even if he had to do it alone. He was going to level up until he was so strong that no one would ever have to be scared of monsters ever again. Not even Bakugo and his cronies could stop him. Letting out a soft sniffle, Izuku put a smile on his face. I know this is weird to ask of you, but do you need anything from the dungeon that you'd be willing to pay for? Giving me a quest, even a minor one, would really help me level up faster. The innkeeper blinked at Izuku's question, seemingly thinking for a moment. He reached down and rifled through one of the shelves behind the counter and brought something back up, handing it to Izuku. It looked like a small iron knife with a wooden handle. The innkeeper smiled. running low on cutlery after a scuffle a few of the tougher guys had a few nights back. We usually just recycle the weapons the first floor goblins use, so if you bring me some of them back, I'll pay you 3 copper per weapon? Izuku waited for the innkeeper to finish, and smiled when he heard the small ding he got whenever he was given a quest. He opened his palm and allowed the quest to form on it. Cutlery resupply, bring the innkeeper goblin weaponry that they can repurpose into cutlery. Rewards, 3 copper pieces per weapon, 75 XP per weapon. Prodigy. Izuku nodded to himself and set the knife back down on the counter for the man to take back. Now that he had the quest officially set up in his system, he ran out the front door, the last remnants of tears disappearing from his eyes. He had gear, he had determination, and he had a quest. If Bakugo and his cronies didn't want to take Izuku into the dungeon with them, then that was their loss. Izuku would just go in by himself and do better than any of them ever could. Predictably, the entrance to the UA dungeon was a very well-developed place. A giant hall had been constructed in front of it, with the entrance on the back wall. The hall had a lot of small offshoots, spaces where merchants and crafters paid top dollar for a spot right in front of the dungeon to buy, sell, and repair the gear of the adventurers that delved into the dungeon. Izuku ignored all of them for now, heading straight towards the entrance. He mentally scanned the squadron of town guards around the large wooden double doors of the dungeon, his eyes settling onto one of them who was obviously the leader of the guard. Identify, Izuku whispered to himself as the guard noticed him approaching and stepped out to meet him. There was a soft ding like usual and a much smaller screen than his own popped into existence. Kiramozan Ryato level 36 class, Fire Dancer, Earth Bulwark, a much smaller screen than usual. Most of the time Izuku at least got a small description about the people he used, identify, on, which meant that Kiramozan was at least danger rating 2 or above if he got such a small amount of info from the ability. The man was a giant compared to Izuku and was built like a truck. Weirdly, his torso and upper arms were bare, but he had an odd red helmet with a horn sticking out the front like a unicorn. He raised his palm at Izuku as he neared, his other hand falling to the pommel of the sword at his hip. Halt before the gate. I will need you to confirm that you're allowed into the dungeon before I can let you pass. Izuku nodded quickly, riffling through his pocket and pulling out his dungeon pass. He handed it over to Kiramozan and waited for the guard to confirm it. After a few moments, Kiramozan nodded and looked over his shoulder. It's legitimate. David. Come over here and give the boy his mark for me, will ya? Izuku watched as one of the guards stepped forward. He looked like a cross between a mage and a rouge, with light clothing covered in dark leather. He also had glasses on, something that definitely made him look more mage-like. David arrived next to Kiramozan and smiled at Izuku. Could you hold your hand out for me, please? I'll just be applying a permanent enchantment to your hand that makes it so we can know that you're allowed in without all this hullabaloo every time. Izuku smiled and held out his hand. David reached out with both of his own and clasped them around it, closing his eyes. Izuku felt a small tingle on the back of his hand, and when David pulled back there was a small golden V seemingly engraved into his skin. Izuku pulled his hand back from the man and his smile grew even wider. David and Kiramozan seemed to get that he was a little impatient and smiled at him. Alright then, kiddo, go on in. But if you're going solo, I suggest sticking to the first few floors. The lower ones can be brutal for someone of your level. Both of the guardsmen seemed adamant about this, so Izuku gave them a small nod. Before he sprinted past them though, he rubbed the back of his head. You wouldn't happen to need anything at the moment? Maybe something you'd be willing to pay someone for doing? The pair looked at each other and laughed. Kiramozan patted him on the shoulder. Trying to get a quest out of us, Squirt? Gotta say, seeing someone with a bona fide, heroic, trait is rarer than you'd think, so yeah, I'll give you one. Izuku grinned as the man took his hand off of his shoulder. The man pulled out a small scroll and seemed to whisper something into the top of it, before unraveling it. Izuku watched, enraptured, as a map seemed to draw itself, the words first floor writing themselves in the top left corner. It wasn't incredibly detailed, but it was more than he had seen of the dungeon. His hands twitched as he almost reached out to grab it, but he didn't want to be rude, so he didn't. Kiramozan chuckled, having seen it. Basically, David is our major spellcaster, and some of his better enchantments require material components. Nothing special, otherwise we wouldn't be sending you to get them, but like powdered goblin bones. Shouldn't be too hard, not even for a low level like yourself. He turned to David and held up 5 fingers, and David nodded. I reckon a single goblin body should be enough bones for the foreseeable future, so we'll give you 5 copper pieces if you bring one back for us to salvage. A silver piece if you salvage it yourself. Fair warning, it can be messy if you don't know how to do it properly. Izuku nodded rapidly, his grin staying on his face. 2 quests. He had 2 quests and they kinda synergized together. He heard the familiar ding of a quest forming and opened up the menu. Goblin bones. Bring the body of a goblin back out of the dungeon with you and give it to Kiramozan and David. 1. 5 copper pieces for intact body. 2. 1 silver piece for the bones. 400 XP upon completion. Looking at the screen with wide eyes, Izuku turned to the pair and gave them a messy salute, before storming past them with a smile, towards the entrance of the dungeon. They gave him a wave as he passed, and turned back to face the town. Izuku passed the rest of the guards and reached the large double doors, placing his hand on the door. He felt the wave of power flowing from the dungeon and heard another ding of his menu. You have reached UA Dungeon, party size 1. Do you wish to enter? Nodding to himself, Izuku pushed forward, feeling the menu acknowledge his choice. A second later his vision faded for a moment, everything going black before suddenly the air around him shifted and his vision returned. He had been transported into the first level of the dungeon. The first level of the dungeon was pretty much what he expected. Dark, cavernous rooms filled with loose bricks and moss-covered floors, torches lining the walls to give light to things that couldn't see in the dark. Already Izuku could hear the echoes of goblin speech and rats scurrying up ahead. From the research he had done, he had figured out that the first room on any floor was a safe zone that no monsters could enter. Usually. Sometimes there were special occasions, but they were few and far between. So while he was safe, Izuku made sure that he was all together before he headed out into the dungeon. Being transported like that made him a little dizzy, so he waited until his head calmed down. It only took a few minutes for him to recover, and he moved towards the hallway in front of him. Like the starting room, it looked ancient, so Izuku kept an eye out for hidden alcoves in the walls where traps could be hidden. His diligence paid off when he was able to avoid an arrow trap completely, cutting the tripwire with a knife before he set it off. The arrow launched anyway, but Izuku wasn't in its line of fire. He moved forward, continuing to check for traps before he reached the next room. He pressed up against the wall as the sounds of goblins and rats became even louder. Drawing his sword, he closed his eyes and took a deep breath. This was it. His first dungeon fight. This would make or break his career as an adventurer. He could do this. He would do this. He opened his eyes and looked around the corner to see where the goblins were and smiled to himself. There were around 3 to 4 of them in the first room, and the room itself was only around 20 meters wide. That meant they were in range for his lunge. He stepped out from the corner and held his sword in his fighting stance, and yelled. Lunge! The world blurred around him as he darted forward, his arm already swinging his sword as he appeared in front of one of the goblins. It didn't even stand a chance against his attack, his sword passing through the goblin with relative ease. The other goblins reacted immediately, picking up their daggers and charging him. Izuku jumped back from the first one swing, before stepping forward again as the goblin overextended and yelling out again. Double strike! A shimmering copy of Izuku's sword appeared above the goblin's head, hitting the goblin the same instant Izuku's real sword did. The goblin died immediately, dropping to the floor. Izuku was forced back by the other 2 goblins, having to dodge both of their attacks at once. He moved around the room, jumping over boxes and generally being hard to pin down. Eventually, the goblins lost their cooperation as one rushed forward to try and stop Izuku from running anymore, and Izuku struck. His sword gave him greater range than the goblin's dagger did, allowing him to run the goblin through the chest before he got within its striking range. The goblin died as well, leaving Izuku with the last goblin, one-on-one. The last goblin rushed him down, jumping at him with its dagger primed to stab him. Izuku sidestepped the goblin's attack, and before the goblin could recover and turn to face Izuku again, stabbed. It fell to the floor, and Izuku smiled to himself. He did it! He quickly ran around the room and grabbed the daggers off of the floor, placing them in his pack so that he could bring them back to the innkeeper. As he did so, he heard another ding from his menu. Congratulations! You have earned 200 XP for killing 4 lesser goblins. Level up. +1 strength, +1 endurance, +5 HP/mana stamina. Izuku couldn't even stop the cheer from escaping him this time, jumping up and down in joy as the menu followed him around, showing him the message. Prodigy was already paying off. If he had gotten to level 7 just from 4 goblins, how quickly would he level up going further into the dungeon? God, he couldn't wait to see what else the dungeon held for him. Rats. Lots of them. That's what else the dungeon held for him, apparently. Izuku let out a yell as he ran around the room, a swarm of rats following him. Why were there so many of them? Well, they were in a dungeon, so that was why, but still. Izuku yelped as one latched onto his ankle, leaning down as he ran to grab it. He threw it at the wall in front of him, dodging another that jumped from the side, trying to grab onto the fur at his waist. The rat he threw slammed into the ground, not moving anymore, and he sighed. At least they weren't any stronger than regular rats. They could have been, being dungeon creatures and all, but they weren't. This was good. He sheathed his sword as he ran, which was harder than he expected it to be, and pulled out his dagger from its sheath above his butt. As another rat dove at him, he slashed at it with the dagger, and it dropped to the floor instantly. If they all died to one hit, then he needed the speed a dagger gave him instead of the reach his sword would. The dagger was also easier to use while running, something Izuku made great use of as he dodged the swarm of rats trying to clamber onto him. He slashed and stabbed with the dagger, each one leaving a dead rat in his trail. Eventually, though, he made a mistake. The room he was in wasn't very large, and his running around eventually led him back the way he had gone before, having gone in a big circle. He slashed at a rat and took a step backwards, letting out a yell as he felt his foot land on a dead rat's body, slipping. He landed on the floor and was too slow getting up before they reached him. Rats clambered all over him, nibbling at him. His gear. He started to stab at the rats, but their numbers made it so he was making little progress. He couldn't let the rats get his gear. He couldn't afford more. What could he do? Think, Izuku, think. That's it. Izuku rolled and pulled his arm back. He looked over to the far wall and focused on a single brick in the wall. He sent his fist flying forward as if he was going to punch the wall. Lunge. He felt the world blur around him again. His body was pulled towards the wall. The rats that were attached to him seemed to come with, but while using his ability he was too fast for them to hold on to. Pain shot up his arm as the world stopped again, his fist now touching the stone wall. It had worked. It was really stupid and now his arm was sore, but it worked. He heard thuds all around him and saw that a lot of the rats that had been on him had fallen off and slammed into the wall. As he massaged his arm, a plan formed in his head. He just needed something the rats would want to eat more than him. He rifled through his pack and grabbed out one handful of his rations. He ran around the room looking for something to hold it there. The room was themed like a storeroom, meaning there were boxes and barrels and bags all over the place. Izuku scooped up one of the bags when he ran past, emptying its contents on the floor. He placed his rations into the bag and put it on the floor behind him, before jumping onto a box nearby, ready to stab any other rats who decided to go after him instead. Luckily, they were the minority. Most of the remaining rats in the swarm focused on the closer source of food, diving into the bag and piling onto one another in an attempt to get to his rations. Izuku stabbed at one of the ones who attacked him instead before dropping down to the floor. He grabbed the bag, now wriggling due to how full of rats it was, and turned to face the far wall, pulling the bag back behind his head, ready to swing it. Lunge. He immediately appeared in front of the wall, the ball slamming into the wall. He heard cracks and screeches from the rats and turned back to the other wall. Lunge. Another dash, another slam into the wall, and the bag fell silent. The wriggling around stopped. He waited another few moments just to make sure some of them weren't playing dead before he heard a soft ding. Congratulations! You have earned 100 XP for defeating Minor Rat Swarm. Izuku smiled as he dropped the bag to the ground. He looked down at his gear and gave himself a mental checkup. He had been lucky to get out of the swarm quick enough that they hadn't been able to do much damage to his equipment. He gave a quick look around the room to see if there was anything else worth looting when he saw something. When he had jumped off the box to grab the bag, he had kicked it away from the pile of boxes it was a part of. And now he could see a hole underneath where the box had been. Congratulations! You have earned 50 XP for discovering Secret Rat Den. Izuku wiped his brow with his forearm as he finished moving the final box in the pile. The hole in the ground was fully uncovered now, and Izuku could tell it was actually a tunnel. While it was fairly short, it was wide enough for about two of him to crawl side by side if needed. The name made him pause before going in. It was a secret rat den. That meant that there were rats down there. Or at least that's where they came from. Was it worth going down there? It probably was. Izuku couldn't think of any reason why there would be a secret tunnel other than to house some form of secret treasure. Guess he was going down there. He dropped onto his stomach and looked down the tunnel. There was a soft light coming from a bend around the corner, but he couldn't see what was creating the light yet. He moved forward, commando crawling his way through the tunnel. He had to use his dagger to stab the occasional rat, but other than those few, there weren't any dungeon creatures. He eventually reached the corner of the crawlspace and gasped at what he found. It was a mini loot room. The small cavern that he had found was just tall enough for Izuku to sit up in, and on the other side of it was a small wooden chest, emblazoned with a golden rat on the lid. The light he had been following seemed to be coming from some bioluminescent mushrooms that dotted the walls and sat around the chest. He reached out and opened it. His first chest. Come on, give me a cool sword. The lid creaked open, the soft glow of the room illuminating the inside of the chest. Sitting inside, on what looked to be a pile of rat leathers, was a big lump of metal, a small pile of coins, and a dagger that seemed to be made of bone, with leather wrapped around it like a grip. Identify as he used his ability on the items, he smiled. Lump of enhanced steel, a lump of steel that has embraced magic into its makeup. Is stronger than regular steel. About the size of a cannonball. 25 copper coins currency rat bone dagger made out of condensed rat bones and leather. Plus 100% damage to rodents. Izuku couldn't believe it. His first magic item. Weren't they usually a second floor and below kind of thing? Did he get it because he found the secret? That has to be it. And not only did he get a magic item, but he also got magic materials. That was arguably better than the dagger. If there was a magic smith in town, he could get this lump of enhanced steel forged into a better weapon. Or even some armor. It was quite the sizable chunk. One problem though, it was very heavy. Too heavy for me to take further down into the dungeon with me. I'd have to go back, finish my quests, and try and find a magic smith that will help me for cheap. He still wasn't the richest adventurer around. Stuffing the lump of enhanced steel into his pack was slightly awkward, but he eventually made space for it. Now came the much harder trip, crawling back up the tunnel with all of his new loot. It took him far longer than the first trip had, and a few times the extra weight on his hip had caused him to slip back down the tunnel a small bit, making it take even longer. Not that he minded. Any amount of time he spent in the dungeon was quite literally his dream come true. Ever since he had learned what classes and dungeons were, his dream was to conquer every dungeon he could find until he was strong enough to fight even the bosses that the Great Scourge would bring. It was his dream to be known far and wide as the best hero the Mightian Empire had, to have people know for sure that because he existed, they were safe from the worst monsters the world could create. He eventually reached the goblin room and made sure to hoist one of the bodies over his shoulder, gritting his teeth. The combination of the enhanced steel and the goblin body made him very heavy, and it was taking quite a lot of his strength to stay upright under the pressure. His steps slowed with the new weight, but he pressed further onwards back to the main room, his only available way out of the dungeon for now. He eventually made his way back to the large double doors and planted his hand on them. He waited a moment before hearing the soft ding of his menu. Congratulations! You are exiting the UA dungeon, plus 200 XP. Level up! Plus 1 strength, plus 1 endurance, plus 1 intelligence, plus 5 HP/mana stamina. The world faded to black again as the dungeon transported him to the surface, and Izuku couldn't be happier at today's dungeon crawl. 2 levels for a single day of work. Sure, he was low level to begin with, but that was impressive. His mood brightened even further as he saw Kiramuzan and David turn to face him. On top of everything that had gone his way today, he also got to hand in a quest. 2 of them. That was always the best feeling. David and Kiramuzan seemed happy to see him. Hey there, newbie. Glad to see you back. And with quite the haul, too. Need help carrying all that? Izuku shook his head and gave the pair a smile. No, I should be fine. Where do you want me to put the goblin's body? Do you have a special harvesting area? Seemingly accepting that he could carry the body on his own, David smiled and shook his head. Nope. Just hand it over and I'll be able to use one of my abilities to harvest it here and now. Wanting to see that in action, Izuku immediately turned and shook his shoulder, letting the goblin body fall off of it, into David's waiting hands. There was silence for a moment before both David's hands and the goblin's body started to glow with red light. The body faded out of existence like a menu that you forgot to close for too long, and in its place appeared a small bag and a handful of bones. David smirked as Izuku's eyes widened, a smile forming on his face. David showed Izuku the inside of the bag that had appeared, and Izuku was amazed to see that it was already filled to the brim with powdered bone. Put a few levels into a craftsman class when I was younger, means I can harvest my own resources. My grandpa taught me that trick actually. He used to be some big-shot adventurer before Emperor Yagi was even born. Izuku could feel his smile growing even bigger. That's amazing, sir. Having that kind of synergy between your classes so early on is almost unheard of. Your father must have been very forward-thinking. David chuckled, nodding. It helped that I knew that I wanted to be a spellcaster ever since my brother in Everything But Blood declared that we would be adventurers together. Yagi had a way with words even then. Izuku nodded and was about to comment on something when what David said registered fully in his head. Wait. Do you mean Emperor Yagi? You can't. That would make you David. Shield. Identify Sir David Shield, High Mage of Mightian level? Class? Izuku almost fainted at the sight. Almost immediately, Izuku was down on one knee, bowing his head to the man, who was quite literally best friends with the Emperor. Oh gods above, he bothered Sir David Shield for a quest. He kept his head down, not wanting to look the man in the eye in case he insulted him. You never really knew with noblemen. I'm sorry for not realizing who you were sooner, sir. I hope I didn't annoy you, and I apologize for wasting your time earlier. Even with his head facing the floor, Izuku could see the people in the entrance hall stopping and staring at him. Or at least, their boots were facing towards him. He couldn't really see faces at the moment. David was silent for a moment, and Izuku started to get really worried. But then, he heard a chuckle. The chuckle grew into laughter, more people joining in. Izuku risked a glance up and saw David with a hand over his face, looking exasperated, while Kiramuzan leaned on the man's shoulder, doubled over with laughter. Izuku was about to fall further into his panic at that when David squatted down and put his hand on Izuku's shoulder. Hey, stand up alright? I know I'm kinda famous for being in Yagi's main adventuring party, but here in Mustafu? I just want to be David Shield, town guard and father. Izuku blinked and followed the man's request, standing up and looking him in the eyes. He saw no traces of deception in the man's gaze, none of the spark Bakugo and his cronies would get before playing a trick on him. "Are you sure, sir?" David sighed, patting Izuku on the shoulder and nodding. "Yeah, I'm sure. After Yagi kicked the Demon King's ass, I requested to be stationed here, so that I could protect young adventurers like you and help out wherever I could. It's nice to get back to your roots. This is where I started my journey, too." Izuku had known that Emperor Yagi and his party had once fought through the UA dungeon, but he didn't know that they had started here. None of the books he had found on the subject had mentioned it. Izuku didn't even realize the smile coming back onto his face, but David and Kirimuzan did. David took a step back and grabbed a small bag from around his waist, passing it to Izuku. "Now that that's all out of the way, I think you have a quest to finish up." Izuku nodded, and as soon as the bag hit Izuku's palm, the soft ding of his menu sounded out through his mind once more. "Congratulations! Quest completed, Goblin Bones option, 1, completed reward, 5 copper pieces, 400 XP." David's eyes flicked to the screen that appeared on Izuku's palm before returning to his eyes. "Well done, kiddo, maybe I'll make this a regular thing. Saves me from having to go into the dungeon's first floor every few days. Can be quite boring once you hit my level." Izuku gasped. "If you would be willing to keep giving me quests, sir, I would be more than honored to complete them for you." David let out another sigh and patted the top of Izuku's helmet. "You're a good kid. Now, go get some proper rest, I'm sure you'll be going back in tomorrow. Come find me tomorrow and I'll see what I can do about giving you another quest." Izuku nodded faster than he ever thought he could, rushing off to the inn. He was gonna be so well rested tomorrow, and then he would get another quest from Sir David's shield. He couldn't believe how awesome today had been. The forge was hot, she was sweaty, and the enhanced iron she was working on was being stubborn, but May didn't care. The clang of her hammer impacting the magic material rung out through her older brother's forge as she forced her magic smithing and material enhancement abilities into the metal. She was in the process of making the rim for a shield. Adventurers like shields, right? Honestly, even though she lived in Mustafu, she had never really paid attention to the adventurers that lived in town. Her passion was smithing and creating, not fawning over some egotistical jackass just cause they could kill monsters. "May, I'm back. You better not have burned my forge down while I was out." There was only one egotistical jackass she could tolerate, and that was because he let her use his forge. She glared at her brother as he entered the forge, frowning as he saw her working. "You better not have used my supply of enhanced ST-. May interrupted him, pouting. "I didn't. You said I couldn't use your enhanced steel until you gave me permission and I didn't." "What, don't you trust me, Otto?" Otto sighed as he pushed back the bright pink hair from his face. "Your puppy dog eyes might work on the guards, but they don't on me. I do trust you, but I also know you get a bit erratic when you smith things. I can't have you wasting enhanced steel on a project you never actually finish. It's expensive stuff." May grumbled, dumping the circle of enhanced iron she had created into a pool of water, her goggles protecting her eyes from the blast of steam that rose as the metal cooled rapidly. She let it cool off for a few more moments before using some tongs to pull it out and place it back onto the workbench. Her magic smithing ability, at the strength she had gotten it to, made it so that anything equal to enhanced iron and below was easy to manipulate. Unfortunately, anything stronger than that started to get pretty pricey, so Otto never let her use any significant amount of it. As if to tease her, Otto reached up to the lockbox that he kept the stuff in and got out some, taking it over to his section of the forge. May glared at him, and he at least had the decency to look guilty. May kept glaring at him the whole time he was setting up for his project, but after a while, he seemed to tune her out in favor of focusing on the metal. May gave up glaring at him after that, choosing to follow him around as he worked instead. "So, what are you making? Another sword?" "No, too much material for a sword." "Oh, you have the treated leather out. Maybe a warhammer or great axe? Did one of the new adventurers commission it from you?" Before she could go any further in her interrogation, Otto placed his hand on top of her head. Look, slow down, alright? You'll never get anywhere as a smith if you ask questions faster than your client can answer them. Damn! He knew what she was all about. She huffed, moving over and sitting on a stool to watch as Otto worked. If you must know, some new adventurer brat with a god complex dropped a bag of silvers on my counter earlier and demanded a set of dual blades. May frowned. That sounded like adventurers all right. Thinking that just because they could fight that they were better than people with non-combat classes. If people like her and Otto didn't make them the gear they used, they'd never get anywhere. Eventually, the sun set outside, forcing them to turn the light runes on. Otto put the project he was doing onto the workbench and covered it with a cloth, making sure to lock the enhanced steel in its lockbox again, glaring at May as she pouted. Look, I know you need less sleep than I do, but if I find out that you broke into this box while I was sleeping and took some enhanced steel to use for some project of yours, I will stay awake just to prevent you from sleeping for a week. Otto yawned and moved over to the doorway that led from the shop front to their living area. Pausing, he turned back to her. Look, this isn't me trying to be mean, but we don't have enough money to spare at the moment for me to let you go crazy with it. She sighed, dropping her elbows onto the table and holding her head up with her hands. I wouldn't waste it if you let me, I'd make some really cool things. Otto just shook his head. You can make your cool things when some maniac is crazy enough to trust you personally with some enhanced steel. Until then, you follow my rules. Ignoring May's final pout, Otto left the room and went to sleep, May following him a few hours later. Hello? I saw the sign out the front with the symbol for a magic smith on it. Are you free to work on something at the moment? May, who Otto had left in charge of the store for the day, looked up from the counter at the green-haired, nervous-looking boy smiling at her, a chunk of enhanced steel in his hands the size of a cannonball. She smirked. She had found her maniac. Izuku awoke to the light of the sun reaching his eyes again, a smile forming on his face. He got out of bed and headed towards the bathroom, giving himself a quick scrub, washing off the dirt and mud that had clung to him since he had left the dungeon the day before. He made his way back to his room at the inn and got dressed, ready for the day. After dressing himself, he grabbed the chunk of enhanced steel from the chest and placed it into the pouch at his side. As he rubbed at his eyes, wiping away the last of the sleep that was stuck in them, he heard a soft ding. Congratulations! You reached level 9. You have unlocked a new ability. Shield, unlocked. Izuku smiled at the menu. When had he leveled up? Oh right, the XP he got for handing in his cutlery quest. He had been very tired when he had gotten back to the inn, so his memory was a little fuzzy. He rolled his shoulders as he walked downstairs, humming to himself as he ordered breakfast. After yesterday's fighting and quest finishing, he had a fair amount of coppers, 53 of them to be exact, so he felt that he could afford to buy one of the smaller meals. As he ate, he pulled up his menu on his hand and read over his new ability. Shield halves the damage for a single strike that hits you. Costs 5 mana for each hit. His eyes widened as he looked at the ability. It was awesome. For just 5 mana, he could reduce an enemy's attack by 50%? Sure, it wouldn't stop something that would already be able to kill him from doing so, but it was enough that he could go just that little bit further than he could before. He might only have 9 uses of it at the moment with his mana on 45 now if he didn't identify at all, but that was still 9 hits that he could make not hurt as much. Which in of itself was a major boon. No wonder so many adventurers started as a fighter. Letting his menu fade, Izuku focused on the last few bites of his meal, finishing it before getting up and handing the bowl back to the innkeeper. Receiving a nod in return, Izuku headed out into the town for the day. He couldn't go on another run with the giant lump of enhanced steel on his hip, so he planned on finding a magic smith to take it off his hands. Maybe he could even start paying for a new sword, or maybe even a breastplate. The streets were very active for how early it was, but he probably shouldn't have been so surprised at that fact with so many adventurers in town. Another surprising thing was the fact that the craftsmen were apparently up even earlier than the adventurers because most of the stores along the streets seemed to be open. Merchants and craftsmen were shouting to the adventurers that passed their stalls, showing off their wares, everything from clothes to potions, as well as a few dedicated buildings with signs on the front to show what kind of shop they were. After a while of searching, Izuku eventually found a building that had the empire-wide symbol for a magic smith on it. It was essentially the silhouette of an anvil with a star shape cut into the side. Heading towards the building, he pushed open the door and was happy to see that there was someone at the counter. She had thick, pink hair, and her golden eyes seemed to almost zoom in on Izuku as he entered. She smirked at him, and for a moment Izuku felt a little uncomfortable, before pushing it down. "Hello? I saw the sign out the front with the symbol for a magic smith on it. Are you free to work on something at the moment?" The girl's eyes darted from his face to the lump of enhanced steel he was holding, then back up to his face. The smirk turned into a full-blown grin, and the girl nodded. "Yep. I'm assuming you want me to forge something with that?" Izuku nodded as he placed the chunk of metal down onto the counter gently, doing his best not to damage the hardwood countertop by dropping it. Sighing with relief, he shook his arms out. Enhanced steel was damn heavy. The girl was on it immediately, tapping away at the chunk with a small hammer. Izuku didn't know the specifics, but he was pretty sure she was testing the quality of the chunk, somehow. She kept tapping away at it, getting more and more excited as she did. After a while, she dropped the hammer onto the bench, and before Izuku could react, she had leapt over the counter and grabbed onto his shoulders, shaking him rapidly. "You! Do you even know what you've brought me?" Removing himself from her grip, Izuku let the room stop spinning before he spoke, shaking his head. "I just know that it's enhanced steel, sorry. Did I do something wrong? Is it not what I thought it was?" Izuku was surprised to see the ear-to-ear grin that covered the girl's face. "No, you bushy-haired blockhead. It's perfect. 98.7% purity. How the hell did you find this? You can't be a miner, you have a sword. Did you find it in the dungeon?" Izuku nodded slowly as the girl pushed her way into his personal space again. Yes. I found a hidden cavern and it had that chunk in it." "Why? Does the fact that it came from the dungeon mean anything?" The girl's eyes glinted. "What it means, adventurer boy, is that you found enhanced steel in the dungeon. That usually means it likes you, and will likely give you more. It's never an exact thing, sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not, but it's still a renewable source of material." Again, before he could react, she had taken hold of his shoulders. At least she wasn't shaking him this time. "My name is Mightian. Your new, exclusive, magic smith. I have a unique deal for you, adventurer boy." The smile on Mei's face, as well as the sheer amount of excitement in her golden eyes, seemed to rub off on Izuku because his heart seemed to pick up in excitement. "A deal? What kind of deal?" Mei let his shoulders go and jumped back over the counter, sitting on the stool as she grabbed a piece of parchment and a pen. Shocked at the sudden movement, it took Izuku a moment to follow her. "What's your name, adventurer boy?" Izuku blinked, shocked to remember that he never introduced himself. "Oh. I'm sorry. My name is Izuku Midoriya." She nodded to herself and continued to write what seemed like some kind of contract, but Izuku couldn't read it with it upside down. He stayed quiet and allowed her to write before suddenly she flipped the paper around so that Izuku could read it. Business deal number 1. Participants, Mightian/Izuku Midoriya. Izuku Midoriya, adventurer, will supply 90% of any enhanced steel for free to Mightian, and in exchange, Mightian will be Izuku Midoriya's exclusive magic smith, getting a 100% discount on items she makes with said materials. Option selected, sign here. Izuku raised an eyebrow at the contract. He glanced up at Mei, who was resting her face on her fists, her cheeks getting squished up as she watched him expectantly. It was a classic case of puppy dog eyes, something that Izuku himself had used in the past, but it turned out that didn't mean he was immune to them. "So, Mei." The girl perked up immediately. "Yes. What is it, Midoriya?" Izuku hummed as he held the contract up. "Wouldn't you be better off not giving me stuff for free, even if I'm giving you so much material?" She laughed, shaking her head. You'd think so, but no. Do you know how expensive enhanced steel of this kind of quality usually is? And this size too? More than I'd make in a week selling enhanced iron gear. Izuku's eyebrows raised at that. Mei continued. No, getting a semi-consistent supply of material like this for free? It would increase our savings and our profits by so much, giving you gear for free wouldn't even put a dent in them. Izuku nodded, kind of understanding it. He might not be a merchant, but he understood a little about business from some books he had found. What Mei was saying made sense. So essentially, me supplying you with materials for free far outweighs the potential costs of making things for me? Mei's smile grew even further as she nodded rapidly. Exactly. So what do you say? You even get to keep 10% of the material for your own purposes. You can sell it, throw it at things, whatever you want. Izuku read over the contract again. This was a passionate, magic smith, offering up free equipment in exchange for something that Izuku would be collecting any chance he got anyway. He picked up the pen, ignoring the squeal of joy that came from Mei as he signed the paper. For a low-level adventurer like him, this deal was quite possibly a miracle. Izuku left Mei after a while of hashing out some details on what he wanted to be done first, a small chunk of enhanced steel in his hands, his 10%. He wasn't even really sure what he could do with this amount. Was there really anything he could do with it? Not him specifically, he didn't have a craftsman class, but what could he have done to a chunk of enhanced steel that was smaller than an apple? Maybe he should just sell it to Mei? There was nothing in the contract he had just signed that said he couldn't, and honestly, she seemed pretty desperate to use as much of the material as she could. She had said that their deal was created because it was beneficial for business, which it technically was, but Izuku could recognize the need to become better in his class. He had made some pretty stupid mistakes back when he started for the same reason, and the scars he still had the first few fights he had ever had as a fighter were proof of that. Craftsman classes had a slightly different growth system to combat classes, but they still needed to perform ever more difficult challenges that lined up with their class to get the majority of their XP. While it technically was possible to reach level 100 just by forging things of enhanced iron quality, it would take far longer than most people's lives were. To continue to grow in level, people of any class needed to do more and more challenging things. If he was right about how desperate Mei was to get her hands on some enhanced steel, then she probably had plateaued at her current level. So not only was he going to be getting free gear, but he was also helping her improve in her own class. It wasn't just a nice thing that everyone should be doing, it would also make the gear she made for him even better as she improved. Pocketing the small chunk of enhanced steel, Izuku rested his hand on the pommel of his current sword as he walked. Specifically his current sword. He and Mei had decided on what he would be getting out of their deal first. A new sword, and some metal shin plates. Crawling through the hidden rat den had shown that his current armor offered little to no protection for his lower legs, something he wanted to rectify straight away. But honestly, Izuku was way more excited for the sword. His current one was hard-earned and well-forged, but it was still only a mundane, iron sword. To go straight from the lowest-tier metal sword there was, to a enhanced steel sword, forged by a proper magic smith? It was almost unheard of, and Izuku knew just how good a deal he had gotten out of Mei. Mei, why is there a contract sitting on the table that says some adventurer is going to give you enhanced steel for free in return for free gear? Mei looked up as Otto entered the forge area, her contract with Izuku in his hands. She smiled. You said I couldn't work on it until a maniac trusted me with some. So I found a maniac. There was silence for a moment as what she said seemed to sink into Otto's brain. A sigh escaped him as his shoulders sagged. God damn it, Mei, I leave you alone for one day. Mei's smile grew wider as she hammered some of the enhanced steel into the shape of a blade for Izuku. I'm not apologizing. I followed your rules. Any lawyer would take my side in front of a magistrate. Otto seemed conflicted, glancing between her and the work-in-progress blade, before letting out another sigh. All right then. I'll leave you to it. You make sure to honor this deal as best you can though. This is lucrative in a way I've never seen before. May nodded, but Otto continued. I'm serious, May. This deal you have? If you piss this kid off or don't fulfill your end of the deal because you got too worked up in a side project, you're going to lose him to the next magic smith, with big dreams he finds. May pouted. Otto, it'll be fine. I promise. This sword is for him. I'm focusing on his projects first before using the rest. Trust me, alright? Otto looked at the blade she was working on, before grabbing his forging gloves from the wall and walking over. Alright then, I'll trust you with this. You want me to give you some pointers? I've been working with enhanced steel longer than you have. May perked up, her smile growing as she nodded. Yes. Let's make this sword our best one yet. Reaching the front of the dungeon again, Izuku found himself feeling even more nervous than last time as Sir David Shield himself approached him. He seemed to notice how uncomfortable Izuku was because he smiled and held his hand up, waving to Izuku. Hey there, Squirt. You ready to go into the dungeon again? All rested up? Izuku nodded robotically, and David laughed. I'm guessing that you're still a little nervous. That's fine. I get that I'm a pretty big deal to you young adventurers and that it will take a while before you get used to treating me like your regular guard. But I'm sure we'll get there eventually. Izuku stood upright as David said that, putting a wobbly smile on his face. Yes, sir. I'll do my best. Face palming, David chuckled. I'm sure you will. Now, I have a quest for you today as well, if you're willing to go a little further into the dungeon than you did yesterday. That caught Izuku's attention immediately. His nervousness seemingly forgotten, a smile flew onto his face as he leaned in. You do? What do I need to do? David laughed. Good to see that you're still enthusiastic, kiddo. Basically, I need you to get me some of the green mushrooms that grow in the warp chamber for floor 1. You do know what a warp chamber is, right? Izuku nodded. Yep. It's the room after a sub-boss or boss fight where you can leave the dungeon without having to go all the way back up. Is it true that they didn't exist until the dungeon was beaten for the first time? David shrugged. Not sure, there aren't really any written records from that long ago. The Demon King wasn't a fan of the dungeon but wasn't able to destroy it, so ruining all records of it was the best he could do. Clapping his hands, David continued. Anyway, I need you to get me at least 15 of the greater HP mushrooms from the floor 1 warp chamber so that my daughter can practice making potions. I'll give you 5 silver for the lot. Izuku's mouth dropped open as he gasped. 5 silver for such a simple task? I'll do it. Does this quest have a time frame I should be worried about? Might take me a while to get past the floor 1 puzzle chamber. A smile grew on David's face. I'm sure it won't give you too much trouble. You seem like a smart kid, so you'll probably figure it out quickly. I won't give you any clues though, no cheating. Reaching into his pack, David rummaged around for a short while before handing a small green mushroom to Izuku. It was forest green with bright blue dots over the cap, the dots softly glowing even in the daylight. There isn't really a set time frame, but I would like them sooner rather than later. That right there is what you'll be looking for. They grow in most floors' warp chambers, and floor 1 is one of them. All you have to do is clear the first floor and you'll get to them. Izuku nodded to David, a smile growing on his face as a ding hit his ears, his menu popping up. Mushroom Collection. Retrieve greater HP mushrooms for Sir David Shield. Rewards 5 silver per mushroom, 50 XP per mushroom, 100 XP for completion. Izuku swiped away the menu, happy now that the quest had created itself in his list. David nodded as he saw the screen pop up, even if he couldn't read the words on it. Waving Izuku through, David smiled. Alright then, you're all good to head on in, I think. I will say though, if you plan on doing daily runs like this, you should look into getting some better gear. I'd suggest the Hatsum Forge, they do good work. Izuku blinked at that. His smile grew even wider. Oh wow! I already have a deal with them for gear. But to hear you suggest them makes me sure I made the right choice. Thank you so much, sir. David smiled as Izuku rushed past, waving to him. But as Izuku pressed his hand to the door of the dungeon, disappearing in the swirl of light, he didn't see the look David gave him as he moved past, his face scrunched up in thought. Izuku moved through the first 2 rooms of the dungeon much faster this time. The goblins went down just as easily as they did last time, even more so now that he was 2 levels higher than yesterday's fight with them. He also tried out his new, Ratbone dagger, but didn't really notice the increased damage. Rats already died to 1 hit. He hadn't got a level up from the goblins and rats this time, and he received no XP from uncovering the secret rat den again. Luckily, his crawling wasn't for nothing. There were 25 copper coins, just like last time, but there was also a lump of brown cloth. Identify. 25 copper coins currency rat leather cloak, a small, tattered cloak made out of leather, 15% resistance to all rodent attacks. Izuku couldn't help but smile as he stuffed the cloak into his pack, crawling his way out of secret rat den. Wiping the mud off of his knees as he exited, he flung the cloak around his shoulder, tying it around his neck. He didn't feel any different, but when he opened his menu to check if it was working, it reported back that he did in fact have the 15% resistance to rodent attacks. He thanked the dungeon, patting the wall next to the doorway, and moved on, a grin on his face. Floor 1, get ready to be beaten. Izuku frowned as he watched the floor of the room he had just reached. He had fought through a few more goblins, and he had gotten to a room where the floor seemed to spike up every now and then, hitting anything that crossed over the floor from below. It seemed like he had reached the floor 1 puzzle chamber. Most floors of a dungeon had at least one, but there were usually a few floors that had more. This one should be pretty simple, as the difficulty apparently went up the further into the dungeon you went. They didn't seem to actually be a spike, more like cylinders about as round as the wheel of a cart, but they shot up fairly quickly, and would probably bruise really badly if you got hit. Which was something Izuku was definitely planning on avoiding. To make things worse, there was some form of smoke drifting along the floor, making it nearly impossible to see any of the floor moving before it shot upwards. Weirdly, the sudden movement didn't seem to even bother the smoke, either. As Izuku sat near the doorway, he tried to think of what the solution to the room was. He knew from the books he had read that all puzzle chambers had a solution, even if it was odd or illogical or had clues only the most dedicated of adventurers could find. Hell, he had even read that there was a pair of dungeons a few centuries ago where you had to have 1 person in each dungeon's puzzle room for the doors to open. But first-floor puzzles? They were usually simple. Maybe the spikes were created by an increase in weight? He searched around the little area he was standing on for a rock, throwing it onto the ground in front of him. He waited a little while and frowned as nothing shot up from the floor where it had landed. Alright, it's not based on weight. Izuku hummed as he stared at the floor, hearing it rumble every now and then. Honestly, he couldn't really detect a pattern. Maybe he was just supposed to leave it up to luck? No, that wasn't really a solution. There had to be something. He closed his eyes and rubbed at his face as he thought, before stopping as something entered the very edge of his hearing. It was a bell? Or at least something that sounded like one? It was coming from the left side of the OH. Izuku watched as a second after the sound rang out, a spike shot out of the floor on the left side of the room. A smile came onto Izuku's face as he stood up, brushing some dust off of his butt, and stepped forward, closing his eyes, listening for the soft noise of the bell. He could barely hear it over the shifting noises of the room, but he thought that he might be able to do this. His eyes closed, Izuku stepped onto the floor. He started walking quickly towards the other side, trying to take light steps so that he didn't make too much noise. A few steps and he heard the small ding to his right, and shifted over to the left, opening his eyes enough to see the spike shoot out of the ground beside him. Smiling to himself, Izuku continued onward, having to dive forward for the next one as the bell came from directly below him. He huffed as he saw the spike that would have smacked into him return to the floor, and kept moving. He pushed himself to his feet and tried to listen out for the bell again, but his foot slipped across the ground, making a loud noise that blocked him from hearing the incredibly soft sound of the bell. His eyes flew open, and he saw that he was only a few steps from the end of the room. He dived forward again, trying to make it to the safety of the platform, when a spike shot out of the ground, slamming into his side, making his yell as he landed on the platform. 12. Impact, damage. Groaning, Izuku coughed and stood up, rubbing his chest, knowing that a bruise was probably going to form there. It wasn't the first time he had ever been hurt, but it was the largest amount of damage he had taken in a single hit. Looking over to the doorway, Izuku froze as he saw a pedestal with 4 differently colored gems on it and 4 slots in the doorway. He grabbed the gems and put them into the slots from top left to bottom right, and hoped that the door would open. There was a loud thump from behind the door, and Izuku was about to cheer when his vision flashed white. With a thud, he landed on his ass and looked up to see that he had been teleported back to the other side of the floor. What? Mei's smile couldn't be wider as she slammed her hammer down onto the chunk of enhanced steel. The contract with Izuku was still fresh in her mind, and she honestly was still processing the fact that after so many months of bugging Otto to let her use enhanced steel, an adventurer of all people would be the one to help her. Her smile immediately dipped a little as she thought about adventurers, so she focused on the fact that she now had a fairly stable source of metal to use for things. Which was amazing. Not even Otto had to deal with anyone who got stuff like that usually. She didn't know what Izuku could have done to get the dungeon's favor, especially since he had arrived the day before, but it wasn't her place to question the whims of the UA dungeon. Whatever the reason was for the dungeon core giving Izuku stuff didn't matter to her, 'cause she profited off of it. Her hammer smacked into the metal again, her magic smithing ability activating with each hit, changing the shape of the metal slightly with each impact. She had separated the chunk of enhanced steel that Izuku had brought her into a few smaller chunks to use for various things. At the moment, she was working on a sword for the boy. Even with its fairly simple design, a simple short sword with a white handguard, she was excited. It would be her first weapon made entirely of enhanced steel. She had just finished getting the lump of metal into a shape reminiscent of a baguette when she heard the bell from the front door ring. Mei? You in here? Otto asked that I come to check on you. Mei smiled as she heard her friend's voice and poked her head out of the doorway, grinning widely. Melissa waved to her from the front door of the Hatsum Forge. She was tall, with bright blonde hair and blue eyes. As she brushed her hair back, Mei glanced at her pointed ears. Half-elves had cool ears. She had some new outfit on that Mei didn't recognize, but it seemed to match her eyes, which was pretty cool. Melissa was a runecrafter, able to add the magical enchantments to weapons, armor, and trinkets that adventurers wore to increase their capabilities. She and Mei had instantly hit it off after they realized that Mei's magic smithing meant she could make weapons capable of handling runes without breaking. Melissa! Come in. I need to show you this. Melissa yelped as Mei pulled her into the back room, but didn't complain. It wasn't the first time it had happened. She smiled as Mei slammed her hammer down into the lump of metal one more time before turning to her. Look at this, Melissa. I have enhanced steel to work with. Melissa raised her eyebrow as Mei showed off the lump of metal, and the air in front of her seemed to come to life as a circle of blue light appeared above her palm. The rune pointed at the lump of metal. Appraise enhanced steel shortsword in progress, a simple shortsword made out of enhanced steel, forged by Mei Hatsum. Whistling to show her surprise, Melissa smiled as Mei danced about in excitement. How did you convince Otto to let you use the supply you have? Mei's smile was gigantic as she grabbed Melissa's hands, bouncing up and down. That's the thing. He didn't. I have my own supplier now. An adventurer named Izuku arrived the other day and the dungeon seems to like him. Melissa perked up at that and laughed. That's amazing, Mei. What are you going to do with the material? May pointed at the in-progress sword. Well, here's the thing. I get 90% of the metal he finds for free, and in return, he gets free gear. It's a win-win. As May smiled, Melissa just stared at her, shock on her face. What? I thought you hated adventurers. Why offer one a deal like that? May paused and frowned. Well, I don't hate adventurers. They just annoy me. Or at least most of them do. Honestly, I don't know much about Izuku, but he doesn't seem rude like all the others that have come in to buy stuff from Otto. Melissa frowned as she heard May's reasoning. Whatever you say, May. But are you sure that this is a good idea? Free gear for anyone is a risky thing. What if other adventurers start bugging you for free stuff? May hoisted her smithing hammer onto her shoulder. I'll just smack them with my hammer. Otto once told me that using my magic smithing ability when hitting metal armor can do some really hefty damage. Melissa still looked skeptical but didn't push it any further. Instead, she pointed to the hammer May was using. Oh. I just remembered, that rune I told you I was trying to create a while ago? The one that increases skill use through a tool? I think I figured out how to make it work. May's eyes sparkled. Really? Did your menu tell you that it worked? You know that's usually how you can tell. Melissa nodded. Yep. My curious trait pinged once I finished up with a design last night. I didn't try it out at home, not after that fire shield rune I attempted burnt my bedsheets, but I thought that maybe you'd let me try it on a hammer so you can use it? Think of it as paying you back for letting me practice my runes on your old, enhanced iron stuff. May's smile grew even wider as she gasped, rummaging through a toolbox in the back of the forge. I would love that. Here. I have an old hammer you can test it on. May thrust the hammer into Melissa's hands, smiling as the girl started humming a tune, light appearing in her palm, as well as on the hammer. Melissa was such a good friend. Melissa pulled her hand away and smiled at May. All right, I think this will work. Go ahead and give it a try. May grabbed the hammer off of the table and turned to the lump of enhanced steel she was turning into a sword. Placing it down next to it, she used some tweezers to put the lump back into the fire for a little bit, before placing it back on the bench and slamming her hammer down into it. She activated magic smithing as she did and marveled at how much smoother the changes in the metal were, almost like a constantly shifting image instead of jagged changes. Melissa. This is amazeballs. I can feel how much better the hammer is transferring my skill. You're a genius. Wait, you guys get to name the runes you create, right? What are you going to call the rune? Melissa hummed as she tapped her chin. Probably something simple, don't want it to be too hard to remember. I'm thinking something like, utility rune, skill efficiency. How does that sound to you? May grinned. Sounds awesome. You're 100% going down in the history books for this one. Let me get to a point where I can stop smithing and we can go celebrate with your dad. A few minutes later, the chunk of metal, now looking a lot more like a sword, laid on the workbench unattended while May dragged Melissa off towards her father's post, gushing about how helpful Melissa's creation would be. Izuku groaned as he sat down, looking at the damned puzzle again. Obviously, it wasn't as simple as just getting to the other side and inputting the crystals into random slots. Rubbing his side, which was still stinging slightly from the impact, he looked around the room to see if there were any other clues. The soft dinging of the warning bells continued to chime as he did so, with the spikes shooting up every now and then. It was a few minutes later when Izuku spotted the clue. Stuck to the roof was a shiny gray gem. It was the same shape and size as the ones he was meant to put into the door on the other side, and Izuku could feel that it would help him get the solution. Scooting over to the spike field, he placed his foot onto the floor while watching the gem, smiling when it lit up a brilliant red. It didn't change color though, not even after a few seconds of leaving his foot on the floor. He removed his foot when he heard a warning bell go off nearby, but luckily the spike wouldn't have hit him either way. He looked back up and saw that the gem had gone gray again. An idea formed in his mind, and he stood back up. Listening out for the bells, he stepped out onto the field, looking up at the gem. As soon as his foot hit the ground, the gem sparked again, this time bright blue. Alright, blue gem goes first. He had to dart to the side after seeing the gem, as a bell went off, and his eyes instinctively darted to the ground to see where the spike was, only to dart back up when the color flashed. The gem changed colors before his eyes once again, the bright blue slowly swirling away, leaving a burnt orange gem in its place. Blue, then orange, got it. Almost as soon as he had registered the colors, he heard another bell in the edge of his hearing and rolled forward, spotting one that had come up from directly under him. He saw the light change slightly and forced himself to ignore the spike as he checked what the gem had changed to. The orange had bled away, and in its place, a deep purple covered the gem. Smiling to himself, he heard the soft chimes of the bell to his right and sidestepped to the left, before booking it to the other end of the field, dodging spikes as he went. Now that he knew 3 of the 4, he didn't need to see the last one to know what order to put them in this time. He reached the pedestal and grabbed the gems out of the holder, moving over to the door. He placed the blue gem first, followed by the orange, and then after that the purple. Grabbing the final gem, which was bright green, Izuku slotted it into its place and heard a much louder bell than usual go off. He smiled to himself as the door dropped into the ground below, and the spikes quieted as they stopped shooting from the floor. Izuku knew that he would probably have to go past this puzzle again every time he wanted to get to the end of floor 1, but finishing it for the first time felt special for him. Ocean blue, burnt orange, deep purple, bright green. I wonder how many variations of that I'll see in my life. Patting himself down to get rid of some of the dust that clung to him, he pressed on, eager to get to the portal room and complete Sir Shield's quest. Mr. Melissa's dad. Guess what? David turned his head to see Melissa being dragged along behind Little Handsome, and a smile formed on his face. May was a bit wild, but she and Melissa had been good friends ever since they met. Little Handsome and her older brother Otto both had an instinctual knack for smithing that he hadn't really seen for a long while. Most of the guards got their own gear, and many an order had been placed to the Handsome forge. What is it, Little Handsome? Did Melissa set her bed on fire again? Ignoring his daughter rolling her eyes, or not even noticing, Handsome's grin just grew. Melissa finished the thing she was working on. Melissa! Show your dad the thing. David raised his eyebrow as May pushed Melissa forward. Melissa pouted at May before turning back to him and motioning for his backup wand, strapped to his thigh. Could I use that? It's a rune. A soft smile formed on David's face as he pulled the short length of oak wood from his boot, handing it over to her. I didn't know you were working on a rune. What kind of enchantment is it? Melissa smiled as her hands started to glow. I didn't tell you about it because I wanted it to be a surprise. And just before I do it, I want to tell you that I tried it out on one of May's hammers, meaning that I'm 100% sure it works. David waved his hand at the wand, telling her to continue. No matter what she had created, he would be proud of her. She was one of the smartest young ladies around, and he was constantly proud of the work she did. Melissa brought the wand up to her eyes and focused on it intensely. David could tell that she was making sure nothing went wrong as a rune slowly started to fade into existence on the handle of the wand. Utility rune, skill efficiency. At her words, the rune solidified, a small flash of light coming from the wand, and a ding appearing in David's menu, and Melissa's own flashed into existence in front of her, a smile bigger than any he had seen on her before growing. Attuned wand, backup has been enchanted with, utility rune, skill efficiency, 25% increase to skills channeled through this wand. David's eyes widened as he read through the pop-up, a smile forming on his own face. This is... Melissa. This is incredible. My word. How did you? He gave up trying to speak and swept his daughter up into a hug. Marvelous. Just marvelous. Melissa patted him on the back and he put her down. Looking at the small purple square in front of her face, his smile grew. I assume that's the confirmation message? Melissa nodded. Yep. It says that because I added the rune to its first magical item, my rune is now officially recognized as Melissa Shield's skill efficiency. May jumped for joy next to her before squeezing her into another hug, and David just watched, smiling. He knew that his daughter was an amazing runecrafter, but he didn't know that she was so good at it. Dianus, can you see our little girl from up there? She's so impressive. Izuku looked up at the large wooden doors in front of him. He had reached the entrance to the floor 1 sub-boss. Apparently, while only the floors with even numbers had actual bosses, the other floors had enemies that were a little stronger than the average for that floor. From what he had read about the UA dungeon, the floor 1 sub-boss was a large rat that would try to pin him in a corner of its cramped arena. So all he had to do was try and stay behind it, right? Its tail could be a problem though. The books he read didn't say how much bigger than usual the rat was, but no matter the case, he had his new rat leather cloak and rat bone dagger to help out. Placing his hand onto the door, he expected it to just pop open on its own, or to teleport him somewhere. Instead, his menu dinged, opening up. Warning! Suggested party size, 3+ your party is under the suggested party size. Do you wish to proceed? Rewards will be slightly increased due to superior difficulty. Yes/no. Izuku's smile grew as he looked at the words. That was great news. It wasn't like anyone would want to party up with him, not until he was strong enough to prove himself to the other adventurers, so getting increased rewards for being alone was perfect. Yes. As she spoke, his vision flashed white, before he felt the airshift around him. He heard a squeaky attempt at a roar, and his vision faded back in, leaving him in a room about as big as a barn, with a rat the size of an ox in the middle. The fight was on. Why the fuck can't you dumbass get the fucking order right? Bakugo growled as he watched the idiots he had brought along into the dungeon fumble around with the floor 1 puzzle. The floor 1 puzzle. It was supposed to be the easiest, and still, these fucking buffoons couldn't get it right. The mage, on the other side of the spike field, yelled back over. The order seems to change every time one of us gets sent back over to you. I can't find a pattern to it either. Do you see anything that might help us? Bakugo growled and looked around the room again. One of the dumbass was crossing over the field, and something glinted in the corner of his vision. Up there, on the roof. Things changing colors. I think it might have something to do with the person crossing. The mage have him a thumbs up, and Bakugo scowled. Such a fucking simple clue, and yet they had been stuck in this stupid room for an hour while the mage, healer, and Rouge fumbled with the fucking gems. He walked over to the spike field, only getting a few points of damage for his trouble, and smirked as the mage and his group placed in the final stone, and the door fell open. Bakugo smirked as he saw the double doors at the end of the hallway. He was so going to rub it in Deku's face that he finished the first floor already. Damn nerd was probably still stuck in town trying to weasel his way into a party. Alright, keep up, dumbass. I won't carry you through this fight. You have to pull your weight. The rat was actually around the size he expected it to be. But expecting a rat to be huge, and actually seeing a huge rat, were incredibly different things. Izuku's hand flew down to his waist to make sure that the rat bone dagger was firmly in place, and then up to his neck as he tested the clasp of his rat leather cloak. Drawing his sword, he watched as the large rat stared him down. It was a bit unnerving, but Izuku held its gaze. As he watched it, he spoke. Identify Duke of Rats sub-boss, UA dungeon, a large rodent that blocks the passage to the rest of the dungeon. HP, 150 mana? Stamina? Izuku frowned at the block that showed up. It was pretty much stuff that he already knew. And the fact that he couldn't see the Duke of Rats' mana or stamina meant that it was on the very edge of danger rating too. The Duke of Rats didn't seem to like being scanned, releasing another of its squeaky roars. If it hadn't started charging Izuku right after that, he might have laughed at the noise. Diving to the side, Izuku tried to slash at the rat with his sword, grunting as it stopped its charge with surprising agility. Izuku jumped to his feet and avoided the Duke of Rats' counterattack, a swipe with its dinner plate-sized paws. Or at least he tried to, the tip of the Duke of Rats' claws slashing along his hip. 8. Damage taken. Hissing as pain shot up his side, Izuku swung his sword at the Duke of Rats, now that it was closer, cutting a line into the side of it, around as long as the blade itself. 14. Damage dealt. Shield. Izuku cast Shield on himself as he took a step backwards, but he didn't need it as the Duke of Rats missed, the pain from Izuku's attack throwing it off a little bit. Double strike. While the Duke of Rats was distracted, Izuku dashed forward and swung at its head, the shimmering copy of Double Strike, following along with his swing. His sword lodged into the neck of the Duke of Rats, and he heard something crack after the second attack landed. Critical hit. 74. Damage dealt. Duke of Rats is suffering from bleeding too. Duke of Rats will take 4 damage every 30 seconds. He was about to let out a yell of joy at such a successful hit when something impacted his right arm, throwing him against the wall of the arena. 12. Damage taken. Arg. He had forgotten about the tail. Damn, it packed a punch. He checked his menu as he got up, and nodded to himself. His HP was at 55/75. He had almost 3/4 of his HP left, and the Duke of Rats was down to less than half. He only needed a few more strikes or one more big attack like before, and he would win. Actually, with the bleeding too effect that he had inflicted on the Duke of Rats, he would only have to wait 7.5 minutes for the remaining 62 HP it had to run out. But Izuku didn't want to wait like that. This was his first sub-boss fight. He couldn't win it by waiting it out. He had to win it. He went to grab his sword, but his hand closed on empty air. Looking around the arena, he saw it behind the Duke of Rats. He must have dropped it when he got slammed by the tail. Damn. While his sword wasn't an option until he got past the Duke of Rats, he wasn't out of options. Reaching down to his belt, he pulled out his rat-bone dagger. The sight of him holding the dagger seemed to have an effect on the Duke of Rats, making it visibly angry as he brandished it. It let out another squeaky roar and started to charge at him. Izuku smiled and held the rat-bone dagger out in front of him. Double strike. Lunge. Izuku saw a ghostly copy of the rat-bone dagger appear next to his hand as the rest of the world blurred around him, and he swung downwards. The world cleared up again, and he found himself right where he wanted to be, directly over the Duke of Rats. Both of the daggers slammed into the top of the Duke of Rats, as Izuku pushed downwards, and Duke of Rats let out a screech, before suddenly dropping to the floor, its legs giving out. Izuku was standing on top of its back, a smile on his face. Woo-woo! Izuku's cheer echoed around the small arena, and he slid down the side of the Duke of Rats, landing on the ground with a thud. He walked over and picked his sword up, cleaning the edge by wiping it on the side of the Duke of Rats, before putting it back in its sheath. He took a deep breath, the smile on his face not fading as he held up palm up to the roof. "Alright menu, show me what I earned from this." A small ding appeared in his ears and the menu popped up. Floor 1 sub-boss, the Duke of Rats, has been slain. XP gained from sub-boss, 400 XP 12 copper first clear bonus, 200 XP for silver superior difficulty bonus, 100 XP, 1 gold. Izuku stared in awe at the screen, another cheer tearing from his throat. 700 XP from a single fight, and more money than he had ever had at one time. He had a gold coin now. Heck yeah! His celebrations didn't end there, though. As another ding appeared, and a second screen popped up. Congratulations! You have reached level 10 for the class Fighter. Elemental Affinity is available. Please select from the following: Flame Knight, Fire, Earthquaker, Earth, Ocean's Blade, Water, Windweaver, Air, Shining Sword, Light, Night Striker. Dark Izuku smiled as he read over the list. He had been waiting for this moment ever since he got his first level of Fighter. The time when he would get to take the next step in his path towards becoming a hero to all. He had read so many books on the different paths and their pros and cons, and he had a fairly good idea of what he wanted out of his upgraded class. With a grin on his face, he reached down and pressed his choice. The class system that the menu followed was fairly simple. When you were a kid, usually around 4 years old, you would get your traits. The XP boosts wouldn't come into play until you either gained a class naturally or got to age 10 when you chose one of the starter ones the menu offered. You leveled up normally, gaining a few basic abilities, usually starting with 1 and getting 1 at levels 3, 6, and 9. But once you hit level 10, things changed slightly. For combat classes, getting a class to level 10 earned you an Elemental Affinity. There were a lot of Elemental Affinity S, but it meant that your attacks and abilities would gain some properties of that element. Fire made attacks burn on contact and had a chance to ignite foes. Dark had draining features, where you could heal yourself by dealing damage, etc. Each of the elements had its own benefits, but they also came with some downsides, as well. Usually, each element had one that it was powerful against and one that it was weak against. Powerful monsters were able to align themselves with elements as well, meaning that these downsides would show themselves once you started fighting stronger monsters. Someone with only fire-themed abilities wouldn't fare very well against a red dragon, for example. Personally, Izuku had been bouncing between choosing the earth and light affinities for quite some time, and he would deny it if you called him a fanboy for going with Emperor Yagi's favorite elements. He had made his choice though, and he knew what his plan was. Like the element it represented, choosing earth would be a good foundation for him to build his strength. The light elemental affinity was next though, that he promised himself. But for now, his choice was made. He had become an Earthquaker. Emperor Yagi felt something stir deep within his core, but he couldn't tell what. It had been bugging him for the last few weeks, but all of a sudden it had burst, becoming stronger for a moment before settling down again. Like something was pulling on his soul, trying to show him something. His royal spiritualist wouldn't be able to reach the capital for another few days, so he wasn't able to know if it was a spirit or ghost or whatnot. He had his hopes about who could possibly be trying to tell him something from the afterlife, but it was best not to expect too much, lest he be disappointed by reality. Still, this feeling of discontent wouldn't go away. Donning his armor and grabbing his helmet, made from gold-colored metal with a large V on the top, he stepped out of his bedchambers to see one of his advisors waiting for him. "Mirai, what is it you need?" The man was incredibly tall, with dark green hair, highlighted with yellow streaks, the result of coming too close to an acid spitter when they were younger. With a short bow, Mirai spoke. "Sir, you have a magical message from David. It seems his daughter has created a rune. He is requesting that you help to spread the word about it." Yagi's eyebrow rose. It was an odd request, but he was glad for any distraction from the odd feeling inside him. "What kind of rune is it?" "I trust young Melissa's brilliance, but I need to know what I'm telling people about." Mirai's hands glowed, and a rune Yagi hadn't seen before appeared in the air, forged out of the yellow light in between his advisor's palms. The system acknowledges it as Melissa Shield's skill efficiency. It is a utility rune that gives a 25% boost to any ability channel through the item it's engraved on. It's quite remarkable. A smile grew on Yagi's face as he slapped the man on the back. "Mirai! It's more than marvelous. It's magnificent. Something so simple, and because it is a utility rune, it's able to coexist with a combat rune on the same piece of equipment." With this excellent news in hand, Yagi strode towards his throne room. "This is amazing news. We will make any and all craftsmen and craftswomen aware of this rune, and I shall have it placed on my own equipment as well." Mirai's eyes widened. That, sir, is quite possibly the greatest compliment you could give Miss Shield, I'd say. I will get to marking your gear with the rune as soon as possible. Yagi smiled, patting the man on the shoulder. Thank you, old friend. Now, where is Torino? I wish to know if my schedule will be empty anytime soon. I'm swamped these next few weeks, but I want to take a trip down to the old UA dungeon and congratulate Melissa myself, I think. Mirai nodded. I'll tell Sorahiko that you're looking for him, sir. Is there anything else I can help with? Yagi paused for a moment, wondering if he should worry Mirai with the odd feeling he was getting. He decided against it. Not at the moment, thank you. Now, I will go out and start to spread the word about this new rune. Waving goodbye to Mirai, Yagi entered his throne room to see a line of people waiting to petition him for various things. But instead of sitting on his throne and going through them all straight away, he clapped, sending a slight shockwave through the air, ruffling some hair in the crowd. Citizens of Mightian, I have great news. Congratulations! Your class, level 10 fighter, has become level 10 earthquaker. Strength, increased by 2. Endurance, increased by 3. Luck, increased by 1. HP plus 10, mana plus 10, stamina plus 10, your existing fighter abilities have been adapted to your new class. Gained the trait, Earth Touched. Izuku tapped on the new trait he had gained, grinning ear to ear as the description popped up in a new menu next to the notifications. Earth Touched, you have 1. Class attuned to the Earth Elemental Affinity. 20% reduction to damage coming from Earth type attacks. May the wisdom of the Earth bring you strength. Izuku couldn't help the smile on his face as he looked over the menu that had popped up after he selected the Earthquaker. Not only was it nothing but good news, it was accompanied by something that Izuku had never felt before. It was as if the floor he was standing on knew that he had attuned himself to the earth and approved of him. It almost felt like a hand on his shoulder, congratulating him, urging him to nurture the connection. He could feel the earth around him, a little bit, watching him, or at least sensing him, waiting for him to prove himself to the earth. Whispering promises of power into his ear if he continued his path, enough to stand above the monsters of this world in victory. He shook his head, placing his palm on the ground. He could already feel the connection starting to dim again now that the sudden burst of earth-attuned energy flowing through him had slowed down into a trickle, so he needed to make sure that it knew. He didn't want the power to stand above others, monsters or otherwise. He shared his dream with the earth, to have power for the cause of standing alongside his fellow sentient creatures, to protect them from threats. The power that the earth would give him would be put to use in the protection of the land and its inhabitants. He knew that realistically, his dream meant that he would be fighting the worst monsters like the earth seemed to want him to, but it was important to Izuku to understand the difference in motivation. Izuku could barely feel whatever he had felt before, so he hoped that it understood his intentions. He didn't know why he felt like he had to correct something as ancient and powerful as the earth itself, but it didn't seem to mind. Sighing in contentment, Izuku took his palm off of the floor, and the connection to whatever he had been communicating with cut entirely, leaving Izuku alone in a barren room, with only the corpse of the Duke of Rats as company. Getting to his feet, Izuku brushed the front of his gear down to get all the dust off of it. He was about to turn to the Duke of Rats' corpse to see what loot he would get from the sub-boss when he saw a small menu to his right. The edges were frayed, like a rope that had been used too many times. It was a different color to his as well, a blank white instead of Izuku's green menu. He frowned as he saw it pop out of existence, a small ding following it. Before he could ponder what the small white screen meant, a giant menu popped up in front of his face, almost as if to distract him. Shaking his head, Izuku focused on the new menu. The system that all sentient creatures used was fickle and mystical, and he could not presume to know everything about it. The new menu caused him to forget all about the small white one though, as it showed him his loot from the fight. He didn't even have to identify, the descriptions were just on the boss menu. Mantle of the Duke, a thick helmet fashioned to look like the Duke of Rats' head, 15% resistance to all rodent attacks. Non-dungeon rats will avoid you if you wish it so. Whip of the Duke, a thick, 7-meter-long whip taken from the Duke of Rats, 50% more damage to rodents plus 2 to dexterity when held. Izuku tapped on the menu, unable to restrain his joy as the items fell into his hands. These were both magic items. Fairly good ones, too. He took his old helmet off, stuffing it into his pack as he placed the mantle of the Duke onto his head. For a single moment, it flopped off his head, far too big for him. There was a flash of light from the helmet as it drooped, and suddenly it stayed on his head, snug and protective. Izuku whistled as he shook his head around, the magic helmet not budging. The whip of the Duke was stuffed into his pack as well, as he didn't have a use to use for it this run. Still, to get 2 magic items from the floor 1 sub-boss fight was May right? Did the dungeon like him? Could the dungeon like him? He moved to the doorway on the other side of the room and pressed his head up to the doorframe. If you can understand me, dungeon, I cannot thank you enough. Your generosity is perplexing, but I accept it all the same. I will find some way to repay you for this. He pulled his head away from the doorframe and was about to move on when he felt something warm on his palm, which was up against the wall. It felt similar to what he had felt before when he evolved his class, just closer. The feeling of acceptance he got from the wall dungeon faded after a moment, and the door to the floor 1 warp room opened, revealing the glowing room. Izuku nodded to himself and moved inside, eager to collect the mushrooms for Sir Shield. Congratulations! Quest completed, Mushroom Collection 15 mushrooms collected. 850 total XP rewarded. Congratulations! You have reached level 11, HP plus 5, stamina plus 5, mana plus 5, strength plus 1. David smiled as Izuku pulled out the sack of greater HP mushrooms, glancing up at the gear he was now wearing. Izuku knew that currently, his gear was a bit thematic, but he didn't look too weird, right? Nope. Compared to some adventurers I've seen over the years? Someone getting a bunch of rat-themed gear set isn't too weird to me. Izuku blushed as he realized he must have mumbled the last bit. He dropped his head, bowing to the man. Thank you for the quest. I would be honored if you gave me another in the future. David nodded. You certainly completed it faster than I expected you to. Keep this up and the little bonuses you get from your quests will have you outpacing the others in no time. That's what Yagi did when we were kids, you know? Izuku's eyes shot up and sparkled as he smiled. Really? I mean, it's obvious if you think about it that the Emperor would have the heroic trait, but I didn't know it for sure. That's awesome. David smiled down at him. Yep, Yagi would keep me in his party almost 24/7 as he dragged me around, bugging the people of our city for as many quests as they would give him. Luckily, I lived close to the nobles of the city, meaning that there were plenty of people willing to throw a little silver our way to get a temporary reprieve from him. Izuku chuckled, hearing that. I promise I won't do that to you, Sir Shield. I wouldn't dream of wasting your time like that. David shook his head. No, don't worry about that. If you need a quest you can just ask. I'm usually with my team in front of the dungeon, but as an incursion is coming soon, I'll most likely be around the edges of town for the next week or so. Izuku cocked his head to the side. Wait, what? What's an incursion? David gave him a weird look for a moment, before tapping himself on the forehead. I forgot that you and the other newbies traveled here from the west. Not many mana springs in that direction, and none big enough to start an incursion. Apologies. Izuku was about to shake his head and tell Sir Shield that it was alright when David started speaking again. Basically, an incursion happens when the ambient mana in a wild mana spring reaches critical mass and rupture, spitting out a bunch of monsters and creatures. Izuku gasped. How have I never heard of an incursion before? I thought dungeons and demon rifts were the only things that caused monsters to spawn? You're saying they can just pop out of nowhere like that here? David was about to speak when Kiramozan grunted behind Izuku, spooking him. "David, you're making our little rat kid anxious." Kiramozan turned to Izuku and patted him on the shoulder. "Don't worry about it. An incursion can't happen in a certain area around a dungeon, because they absorb ambient mana from the air, meaning that it can't group up into a mana spring." Izuku's eyes widened as the man started spouting facts about mana and mana springs, while the actual mage stood beside them both. But what Kiramozan said did make sense. So where is the nearest mana spring, then? What's the range that the dungeon stops the mana from grouping up in? David tapped his chin. "It's been a while since I checked on the local mana springs, but there are only 2 that are a possible threat these next few weeks. I guess I made it sound like a fast process, but these things can take up to 3 months to reach their tipping point." He continued. "The distance they can appear depends on how old the dungeon is as well, and the UA dungeon usually keeps them a few kilometers outside the town walls. The thing is, I can't go check on them today, lost a bet and am pulling a double shift." David then winked at Izuku, and the boy perked up. Izuku glanced over at Kiramozan, who was smirking and shaking his head. Izuku played along. "If you want, I could go check them out for you. If you're stuck here, that is." David nodded. "Yes, I believe that would be sufficient. Although, as you don't know how to actually check on them, maybe I should." "Hold on." Izuku watched as David pulled up one of his menus, scrolling down what looked to be a list, before tapping on one of the names and waiting a moment. Izuku jumped in surprise as a girl's voice came from David's menu. "Dad? What's up? Do you need help with something?" David smiled. "Yes, actually. Do you think you could go check on the mana springs outside the town and give me your best estimate on how many days there are until they rupture?" "Wait, weren't you going to do that, Tony?" David coughed, glancing at Izuku while Kiramozan laughed in the background. "I will be sending along someone to escort you, just in case. They're fairly heroic, if you understand me. Think of it as an escort quest." Izuku didn't know why, but those words sent a tingle of dread down his spine. Wait, what was so bad about an escort quest? "If you don't want to go, I can probably find a book and learn how to check." There was silence from the menu for a moment before the girl spoke up. No, it's fine. I'll be down near the south gate in 10 minutes, is that okay?" Izuku smiled. "Yep. I'll be there as soon as possible." David nodded, closing the menu. "Alright, I'll give you a gold for protecting my daughter while you check on them, alright?" Izuku nodded, smiling as his menu let out a ding, and the new quest came up. "Shield the shield, protect David Shield's daughter while she checks on the progress of the mana springs around Mustafu. Reward, 300 XP, 1 gold." Izuku read the description and was about to head off when his brain registered what it said. "Wait, your daughter?" David smiled. "Yep, you. Should be fine, but don't screw this up, alright?" Izuku's head was nodding so fast he was starting to get dizzy. "Yes, sir. I promise she'll be fine. I won't let anything hurt her." He then sprinted off towards the south gate, ignoring the laughter of David and Kiramozan from behind him.